The rumble of the concrete mixer trucks jolted me awake at 4 a.m. The sound of their engines echoed through the stillness, vibrating the walls of my house. By the time I stumbled outside in my bathrobe, it was already too late. The wetland habitat, what my wife Sarah loved more than anything, was being buried under an illegal concrete dam. A dam that the Pine Valley HOA president, Catherine Wells, was overseeing, her lips curled in a smirk. "Mosquito control, deal with it," she called out, as if this was all some minor inconvenience. But I knew better. I spent 30 years as an EPA water quality specialist. This wasn't just a dam. It was a federal violation waiting to happen. One phone call, one inspection, and the entire neighborhood, her pristine million-dollar development, could be locked down. This wasn't just about concrete. It was about something much bigger, and Catherine Wells had just made a mistake that would cost her everything. I stood there in my bathrobe watching the damage unfold, knowing exactly how this would play out. But Catherine had no idea what I was capable of when it came to protecting what mattered most. Catherine Wells stood at the edge of the wetland, surveying the destruction as the concrete trucks rumbled past her. The Pine Valley HOA president had orchestrated it all, pouring concrete into a protected 50-acre wetland habitat, all in the name of flood control and keeping the neighborhood presentable for high-end buyers. She was a woman used to getting what she wanted. In her world, the rules were made to be bent or ignored entirely. Catherine, with her high-end designer clothes, expensive perfume, and smooth, practiced charm, had turned HOA leadership into a personal empire. She didn't see the wetland as a valuable ecosystem. To her, it was just another obstacle in the way of the perfect, pristine development she planned to sell for millions. "It's temporary," she called over to Tom Barlow, her voice dripping with condescension. "Just some basic improvements for the neighborhood. The rest of us appreciate it." Tom stood still, his hands clenched into fists, the weight of his EPA career pressing down on him. He had spent decades preserving places like this, places worth millions in environmental value. He knew the consequences of her actions. Diverting water, destroying habitats, and ignoring laws that protected this land wasn't just illegal, it was a federal crime. But Catherine didn't care. For her, the neighborhood's appearance and market value were all that mattered. Tom had no intention of letting her bulldoze through the law, but he had a feeling Catherine wasn't going to take this challenge quietly. The hum of concrete trucks filled the air at 4 a.m., a sound I couldn't ignore even if I tried. I woke up, my body stiff from restless sleep, and heard it again, the unmistakable roar of diesel engines outside. I grabbed my bathrobe, stumbling to the window. My heart dropped when I saw it. The Pine Valley HOA, under the command of Catherine Wells, had sent a small army of trucks and heavy machinery into the wetland behind my property. The concrete trucks were unloading, sending thick, wet cement across the land. The same wetland I had cherished for over 3 decades, the one Sarah loved, where she'd find peace while listening to the creek run through the trees, had now been transformed into a wasteland. I could see the creek, once clear, sparkling with life, being blocked off, forced into a new, unnatural path. The smell of fresh concrete filled the air, mixing with the scent of damp earth. I rushed outside, hardly thinking about the cold. My feet were bare, but I didn't care. The sight before me was enough to burn away all the fog in my mind. Catherine Wells stood on the edge of the construction site, a clipboard in hand, barking orders at the workers. "Mosquito control, deal with it," she said, her voice thick with entitlement, barely even glancing at me. I shook with anger. "Catherine," I shouted, but she didn't seem to care. "What do you think you're doing? This is a protected wetland. You can't just cover it up with concrete." "Oh, Tom," she replied dismissively, "this is a minor issue, just a temporary fix for the neighborhood. Nothing to get worked up about." My hands clenched into fists, and my voice wavered with frustration. "This isn't just some minor issue. You're destroying an ecosystem that's been here for decades. You're breaking federal law." Catherine looked at me, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I'm sure this will all be cleaned up soon enough. The neighborhood will look better, and everyone will appreciate it." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. She was right, everyone would appreciate it. Except the people who truly understood what she was doing, violating federal environmental laws to make her fancy development look pristine. "Is that how you justify it?" I asked, trying to steady my voice. "You're making millions off this, aren't you? Destroying a habitat to line your pockets." She didn't flinch. "If you don't like it, Tom, maybe you should move. This is how things work around here." Her smug tone hit me like a slap, and I turned away before I could say anything else. Catherine thought she had all the power, but I knew better. I wasn't going to let her bulldoze through the law, even if she thought she could get away with it. I walked back into the house, my mind racing. I had to act fast. There was too much at stake: Sarah's legacy, the wetland, my home. I couldn't just let this slide. I spent the next few hours pacing back and forth, but I couldn't let the anger consume me. I needed a plan. Catherine was too powerful for me to take on alone. I had to use my skills, my experience to make sure the law worked for me this time. I spent the rest of the morning documenting everything, taking photos of the concrete dam, the diverted creek, and the damaged land. I wrote down GPS coordinates, made measurements, and noted how the creek had changed direction. This wasn't just a simple construction project. This was a federal violation under the Clean Water Act, and I knew how to prove it. Once I had everything together, I filed my complaint with the county environmental office. It wasn't much, but it was a start. I knew this wasn't going to be easy. Catherine had too many resources, and the HOA had too much influence. Still, I wasn't going to back down. By the time the phone call came, I'd convinced myself I was prepared for whatever would happen next. Mike Castellanos, the county environmental inspector, called late in the afternoon. "We'll be out on Friday morning to take a look," Mike said, sounding tired, like he dealt with enough petty neighbor complaints to last him a lifetime. "I'll review the site and let you know what we find." That was it. No promise of action, no acknowledgement of the serious damage. I tried not to let it show, but his nonchalance made me uneasy. Maybe I was just paranoid. After all, it was still the county, and Catherine had a way of making things disappear. "You'll look at everything I asked," pressing the issue. "The concrete, the diverted creek, the destroyed habitat?" Yeah, Mike said, sighing. "I'll take a look. We'll see what's what." I hung up the phone, trying not to let my frustration boil over. A part of me wondered if Mike was already in Catherine's pocket. I had no way of knowing, but I couldn't afford to trust him blindly. Friday came and went. The inspector had visited the site, but the word from his office was the same: no violations found. I called Mike's office demanding answers. The secretary put me on hold for what felt like hours. When she finally returned, she said the words that nearly made me snap. "Mr. Castellanos completed the inspection yesterday afternoon. No violations found. Case closed." I couldn't believe it. The concrete dam was right there in plain sight, and Mike had signed off on it without even doing a proper investigation. There was no way he had seen everything. The more I thought about it, the more I realized this wasn't a mistake. This was deliberate. Catherine had gotten to him. I was being stonewalled. I wasn't going to let them get away with it, not when the stakes were this high. If the county wasn't going to do its job, I would have to find another way. I knew then that I had to take matters into my own hands. But first, I needed to know what I was dealing with, what kind of corruption I was up against, and I would need more than just county officials. I needed to go higher. I sat at my kitchen table staring at the photographs and documents I'd compiled. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The concrete dam, the diverted creek, the destruction, it was all right there in front of me. But it wasn't just about the wetland. It was about the bigger picture. Something told me this wasn't just a botched construction project. Catherine wasn't just clearing land for a golf course or fixing a minor drainage issue. She was hiding something. I dug deeper. Over the next few days, I went over county records, planning documents, and local news reports. That's when I found it. Catherine Wells and the Pine Valley HOA had been involved in more than just environmental violations. They were pushing for a massive land development project in the area, and the wetland was standing in the way. It wasn't just the land Catherine wanted, it was the power. The wetland was the last obstacle standing between her and a lucrative expansion project. Developers were lining up to buy the land, but they couldn't until the wetland was out of the picture. Catherine had been using the HOA to force through changes to zoning laws and remove environmental protections. This wasn't about controlling mosquitoes, it was about controlling property values. The neighborhood was worth millions, but if the wetland was declared a protected federal zone, all of it would be locked down. Catherine's multi-million-dollar plans would crumble. I felt a cold fire burning inside me. This wasn't just a fight for land. This was corruption at its worst, abuse of power, greed, and destruction of the environment for profit. Catherine had to be stopped, but I needed more than just a complaint. I needed hard evidence that could hold up in court. I knew I couldn't handle this alone. I needed leverage, and that meant bringing in someone who could crack open the case wide. So, I called in federal resources. I contacted the EPA, where I had worked for over 30 years. I knew the right people, and they knew me. I wasn't just some disgruntled homeowner. This was a violation of federal environmental laws. I wasn't waiting for the county to drag their feet any longer. I reached out to Inspector Rebecca Torres from the Environmental Protection Agency. She was an expert on federal wetland laws, and I knew she would be able to cut through the red tape. A week later, I met with Rebecca at the site, armed with a stack of evidence. She looked over the photos and took a few samples of the water runoff. As we stood near the concrete dam, she shook her head. "This is a disaster, Tom," she said. "Whoever's behind this knew exactly what they were doing. This isn't just negligence. This is criminal." Her words hit me like a ton of bricks. Criminal. It was one thing to fight Catherine and the HOA on my own, but now the federal government was involved. Rebecca agreed to file a formal environmental violation report, and the EPA immediately set up an investigation. She also coordinated with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to assess the impact on endangered species in the area. The wetland had been home to a variety of species, including rare salamanders that were protected under the Endangered Species Act. Meanwhile, the pressure on the county continued to build. I called Mike Castellanos again, but this time he didn't brush me off. The county was forced to investigate further with the backing of the EPA. It was only a matter of time before the full extent of Catherine's actions would be revealed. A week later, Rebecca called me with the news I'd been waiting for. The EPA and Fish and Wildlife Service had confirmed that the wetland was home to northwestern salamanders, an endangered species. What Catherine had done was far worse than I initially thought. This wasn't just about the creek and the habitat, it was about triggering automatic federal protection. The 2024 Federal Waters Protection Act had provisions that allowed any significant environmental violation in wetlands to immediately trigger federal habitat designation. If the site was determined to be home to an endangered species, the government could step in and restrict development, ensuring the area's preservation. The worst part for Catherine was that the very thing she had tried to destroy, the wetland, had become even more valuable. The EPA confirmed that her actions had unintentionally enhanced the habitat for the salamanders. She had quite literally built the ideal breeding ground for an endangered species by redirecting the creek and blocking the flow. The legal consequences were already lining up. The EPA was ready to move forward with enforcement, and the county had no choice but to follow federal law. The neighborhood, which Catherine had been pushing to sell for a profit, was about to become a federally protected zone. The HOA's development plans and Catherine's dream of a multi-million-dollar expansion were about to come to a screeching halt. But Catherine wasn't going down without a fight. I knew she would do anything to save herself and her development plans. I'd been waiting for her to make her next move, and it came faster than I expected. That night, I heard a truck pull into the driveway. I stepped outside to find a man unloading construction equipment, jackhammers, saws, and other heavy machinery. Catherine had sent a crew to tear down the dam and remove any evidence of what she'd done. They were trying to destroy the evidence before it could be fully documented. I wasn't about to let her get away with it. I grabbed my camera, and from my porch, I snapped a series of photos, clear documentation that Catherine was trying to destroy the evidence of her federal violations. It wasn't just a cover-up. It was obstruction of justice. I called the authorities, my fingers trembling with anticipation. This was the final straw. Catherine had crossed the line from being a developer to being a criminal. There was no turning back now. The investigation was no longer just about wetland protection. It was about corruption, bribery, and illegal activity at every level. I felt a sense of calm wash over me as I prepared for the confrontation that would inevitably come. This time, Catherine wouldn't be able to talk her way out of it. This time, she would face the full force of federal law. The Pine Valley HOA meeting was supposed to be a regular affair discussing minor neighborhood issues and upcoming community events. But when I walked in holding the evidence that would change everything, the room shifted. The murmurs stopped as eyes turned toward me, the man who had finally exposed Catherine Wells and her illicit actions. Catherine stood at the front of the room, a nervous smile on her face, but her eyes betrayed her. She was trying to control the narrative, speaking with an air of authority. "As you all know, there's been some concern about recent drainage improvements," she said, her voice cracking slightly. "But it's nothing serious, just a bit of routine work for the good of the neighborhood." I couldn't let her get away with it. I stood up and cut her off. "This isn't routine, Catherine," I said, my voice firm. "You've illegally diverted a protected wetland and now you're trying to hide it. Your actions have triggered a federal investigation, and I've got the evidence right here." I dropped the stack of photos and documents onto the table for everyone to see. The room went silent. Catherine's face blanched, and her eyes darted around the room, searching for support. The facade of control she had carefully built over the years began to crumble. I handed out the photos, the GPS coordinates, and the measurements I had carefully documented. The images showed the dam, the diverted creek, and the wetland, now buried under concrete. Every piece of evidence clearly pointed to one thing: Catherine had violated federal laws in her attempt to clear the way for a luxury development. The HOA board members shuffled through the documents, their expressions growing more uncertain by the second. Some looked ashamed, others just confused, but no one could deny the truth. Catherine's face twisted in frustration. "This is ridiculous," she snapped, her voice shaky. "I've been trying to improve the neighborhood. I'm doing what's best for the community. You think this is about some illegal construction? This is about making this place livable?" But the evidence spoke for itself. A federal agency had confirmed the habitat was protected under the Endangered Species Act, and the damage Catherine had caused couldn't be undone. The room was silent except for the soft shuffle of paper, as the board members absorbed the weight of what they had been complicit in. Catherine tried to speak again, but her voice was lost in the growing noise of murmurs and whispers. Her attempts to deflect fell flat as the reality of the situation began to sink in. The truth was out, and there was no way to spin it. Catherine's perfect world was crashing down. Before she could regain her footing, Agent Maria Santos stood up, flashing her badge. "Catherine Wells, you are under arrest for conspiracy to violate federal environmental law, wire fraud, bribery of public officials, and forgery of federal documents." Catherine's face went ashen. She stammered, trying to make excuses, but the agent's calm voice cut through her panic. "You have the right to remain silent." The room held its breath as Catherine was handcuffed, her carefully crafted mask of control completely shattered. The board members watched in stunned silence, the weight of their complicity hanging over them like a dark cloud. As Catherine was escorted out of the room, her face flushed with embarrassment, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of justice. She had underestimated the power of the law and the determination of a man who had nothing left to lose. The crowd stared at the empty space where she had stood just moments ago. The air in the room was thick with a mixture of disbelief and relief. The truth had won. The atmosphere in Pine Valley had changed. After Catherine's arrest, the neighborhood felt different, quieter, yet freer. I walked through what had once been the heart of the wetland, now a federally protected area. The wetland had come alive again, a silent testament to Sarah's legacy. Every time I stood by the water, I felt her presence, her spirit intertwined with the land we had both cherished. The community, once polarized by Catherine's oppressive leadership, was coming together. More and more neighbors approached me, expressing gratitude and shock. Catherine's reign had divided us, but now people started to share their own stories of how they had been manipulated or ignored. They were beginning to understand the importance of protecting the land and standing up for what was right. The sense of unity that started to spread through Pine Valley was palpable. The HOA's influence had crumbled, but something better had risen in its place, a shared commitment to environmental justice and community values. The legal consequences for Catherine were swift and severe. Her mansion, once the crown jewel of Pine Valley, was sold at a fraction of its original price, $168,000 at a federal auction. The buyer, Dr. Sarah Martinez, turned the property into a hub for environmental research, a perfect irony that no one could ignore. Catherine had destroyed the land in her pursuit of wealth, and now it would become a center for conservation, education, and the preservation of what she had tried to erase. The HOA was officially dissolved, and the remaining board members resigned under a cloud of scandal. Pine Valley was no longer the gilded cage Catherine had created. New leadership emerged, committed to restoring the community's integrity. The HOA's former hold on the residents had loosened, and for the first time, they had a voice in shaping the future. As for the county, the investigation into Catherine's actions expanded. Mike Castellanos, the inspector who had been compromised, faced charges, and the local government began implementing stricter environmental oversight to prevent further corruption. It was a reminder that even the most powerful people could be held accountable. One afternoon, I walked through the oak grove Sarah had planted, now flourishing under federal protection. The trees she had carefully tended to were thriving, their branches reaching higher than I ever imagined. The salamanders had returned, and the pools were teeming with life once more. In the distance, I spotted a family of otters, playful and free in the waters. It felt like a dream, a vision of what Sarah and I had hoped for all along. But it wasn't just about the land anymore. It was about securing a future for it. The federal government offered me the position of Federal Habitat Monitor for the wetland. It came with a salary, but it wasn't the money that mattered. It was the authority to protect what Sarah and I had fought for. I had the legal power to ensure no one could ever threaten this place again. Sitting on the porch in the evenings, I looked out over the grove, watching the wildlife flourish. Sarah's memory lived on in every tree, every pool, every bird that returned. It was as if the land had healed, and so had I. The pain of losing her was always there, but the peace we'd fought for was now mine to protect. "I kept my promise, Sarah," I whispered to the evening sky. "This land will always be safe." Looking back, the win wasn't about the victory itself, but how the law shaped everything. Without following the legal process, it would have ended differently. Anger doesn't change outcomes. the law does. There's a difference between standing up legally and letting emotions take over. Evidence and patience matter more than rage. It's about knowing when to involve the right authorities and let them handle it without taking matters into your own hands. Keep records, check public filings, and know when to seek expert help. And always remember, communities thrive when people respect the law. When HOA power goes unchecked, it can destroy everything. But when we protect the law, we protect what truly matters.